So hi everyone, my name is Derek Pratt. I'm the educator and interim curator at the Erie Canal Museum here in downtown Syracuse. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to the second lunchtime lecture to be part of our Erie Eats, Erie Canal Foodways project, which is funded in part through the generous support of the Erie Canalway National Heritage Corridor and the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. Thank you, as always, to them. This year, we're exploring the diverse ways in which the Erie Canal radically impacted how people in New York State and beyond interacted and continue to interact with the most basic building blocks of human life, food and drink. And we are so excited today to be hosting this discussion, Converging on the Canal, the 19th century through food, since we hope to show you just how vibrant and exciting kind of the history of food along the canal corridor has been, especially during the canal's heyday in the 19th century. We have many more programs coming up as well. As part of Erie Eats, you can learn all about our events on our website by visiting eriecanalmuseum.org/events, but I'll tell you very briefly about the next few. This Saturday, so in 2 days, on April 24th at 11, we're hosting, in collaboration with the Scano Great Law of Peace Center, a virtual field trip to Ganondagan State Historic Site, where their site manager, Peter Jemison, many of you may have seen him earlier this year give another talk on food sovereignty. He'll be showing us around the site and discussing the Seneca's agricultural traditions, as well as the Iroquois White Corn Project. Then on Saturday, May 1st at 10 a.m., we're continuing our series of talks presented by the Onondaga County chapter of the Master Gardeners of Cornell Cooperative Extension. That will be all about vegetable gardening. I know on today, with our lovely weather, you might not be wanting to go out and garden, but you know, hopefully by May 1st you will. And our next lunchtime lecture will be a month from now on Thursday, May 27th, also my birthday, and a topic near and dear to my heart. It is the Brew Erie Canal, a short history of Syracuse breweries, presented by Bob Searing, the curator at the Onondaga Historic Association. And all of these events are, for now, virtual, and we hope to see you at them. Also, real quick plug before I get on with the show here. I just mentioned Syracuse breweries. Yesterday, we were proud to announce that we have partnered with Talking Cursive Brewery, 3 blocks away from us here, along the historic route of the canal, what's now Erie Boulevard in Syracuse. They have a new beer, Good Old Pale Ale, where some of the money from that is being donated to us. So check that beer out at Talking Cursive Brewery. Anyway, that's my story. That's my commercial, and I'm sticking to it. So now I have the pleasure to introduce to you Amanda Massey, who is a curator with New York State's Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, serving 37 historic sites, which encompass much of the state's history. She works on exhibition teams, develops furnishing plans, and provides research support for site staff. She received her BA in history from Virginia Tech and her MA in public history from the University at Albany. She has been lecturing on historic foodways for 9 years and has been a home cook for many more. And I also would like to introduce Valerie Balint, who is the senior program manager for the Historic Artists' Homes and Studios, a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is administered at Chesterwood, and is also the author of the newly released Guide to Historic Artists' Homes and Studios. HAHS is a nationwide consortium of 44 member sites, which were the home and working studios of American artists. Prior to heading HASH in the beginning in the spring of 2017, Valerie served for 17 years on the curatorial staff at Frederic Church's Olana, most recently as Interim Director of Collections and Research. She was a co-organizer and co-curator of Olana's annual exhibitions and accompanying publications. Was there she began her research on historic foodways, in particular those of the 19th century and Frederic Church's family at Olana. She is a frequent lecturer and writer on preserved artist spaces in American art and social history in the mid-19th and early 20th century. She is a classically and formally trained cook. Her previous work also includes curatorial positions at Chesterwood and the Frelinghuysen, I definitely butchered that, Morris House and Studio. She served as New York State Coordinator of SAVE Outdoor Sculpture Program of the Smithsonian American Art Museum to document all public sculpture in the United States. She holds an MA in Public History from the State University of New York, Albany. So without further ado, first, I guess I'll say go Great Danes, as you're both Albany alum, and I'll hand it over to you both for our lunchtime lecture.
Thank you so much, Derek. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everything will go smoothly here. And I saw someone say go Hokies, so that's fun that there's even a Hokie, Virginia Tech element here. So thank you so much. If you were, I did get to do a lunchtime lecture a couple years ago. And if you were at that, some of this might look a little familiar. I got the pleasure of doing that with Paul Schneider. Thank you again for having me. And you gave a lot of our background of how we entered foodways. Both of us were our curators with historic house museums. And that's how we first entered talking about foodways, but we both enjoy cooking. And so this is really just a way for us to incorporate something we love into what we do. And we realize that food is such a wonderful vehicle to teach 19th century history. So it's relatable and fun. And you'll see in this picture, we actually usually do food demo along with our food lectures. But given the state of the world right now, we're going to have to, hopefully you have some good snacks at home that you can enjoy while we speak. And we'll hope to return to that format in the future. Today, just to give you a little idea, we want to make sure that we give you a little background. We're going to talk about the Erie Canal and its impact on the American diet, which it sounds like this whole series is. It was here that food, technology, transportation, and information converged to spread throughout the state of New York and into major national and international ports. However, we'd like to look at the canal with a slightly different lens. We want to take the emphasis off just the technology and innovation and shift it to the people who were working in food-related industries. This includes food production, growing food, processing food, shipping food, those who are making food both for consumption and for table. And by emphasizing this aspect of food, we have an opportunity to expand the historic narrative from those who are often overshadowed by prominent historic figures. And Foodways allows us to do that with ease, since really people at every social strata and race were involved in either eating or producing food. And before we jump totally into that, I want to give you a little background on where the United States was at this time, just to jog your American history memory. The Revolution had ended, and the War of 1812 both helped secure the borders by 1825 when the Erie Canal opens, and a series of what could be considered questionable land deals with Native people in New York opened the western part of the state to American settlers. We also had the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which created a huge western part of our nation, or added it to the nation. And then by this time, settlers are filling Western New York. And a lot of those settlers actually happen to be veterans of both of those wars, some of whom actually helped remove the Indians from the land. So they were there, saw the land and liked the land, and then came back after the war. And in addition to all this land expansion, we have the Industrial Revolution happening in our nation. And though interrupted by war, many people started moving into urban areas to the factories that are growing around this industrialization. For example, in 1790, only 1 in 20 people were living in an urban area. And by 1870, 1 in 4 people were. By 1920, it's 1 in 2 people. I don't know the current statistics. The Industrial Revolution also created just more opportunities that fostered innovation. So innovation seemed to create this cycle that innovation bred more innovation. And just for example, the steam engine alone changed travel and factories, making work more efficient and goods cheaper. So one of the places we see innovation related to food is in the kitchen. This is a picture of a hearth. This is a reproduction one at, I believe that is Craylo State Historic Site. And this is where most food production was happening at the beginning of the 19th century. So it's very heavy work, hot work, stooped over pans. There's a lot of lifting, and there's just so much work that goes into feeding a family. You would have started very early in the morning, and it would have gone through into the evening in order to prep food and to clean up afterward. And I think it's really good to remember while looking at this that most middle-class families and higher strata would have had at least one servant working in the house who would have at least helped with cooking and serving. And in many parts of the state, that they might have had enslaved workers working in their household. So manumission didn't finish until 1827, and I'll talk more about that later. So that might have been an enslaved woman cooking in the house. Otherwise, a lot of times it's recent immigrants. This is a house stating this house is furnished to 1850. I believe it's Sackett's Harbor State Historic Site. And this is a good example of what a kitchen might have looked like mid-century. Where you've incorporated this, but it's still really hot and laborious work. And our final kitchen that you get to look at is this is a kitchen at Lorenzo State Historic Site. And it's just a really good example of how kitchens were modified throughout the 19th century. So you can see that a cook stove is pushed into the hearth. You can see openings for the bake ovens. And there's a coffee grinder on the wall. These are all such important pieces of 19th century history. You can see canned goods, which would have been shipped along canals. And I think there's even bell jars way in the back. All these are really important parts of 19th century history. And also something that you don't see in this image, but I will tell you that this household is such a good representation of immigration trends in the 19th century. Where when the house was built in 1808, they had enslaved people in the house, and I'm sure they had local workers as well. But and then in 1850, the census record shows an English and a native-born servant in the house. And then by the early 20th century, there's an Italian family that filled most of the service roles in the house. So this is really a good reflection of the trends throughout the nation. And Valerie is going to talk a little bit more about the Erie Canal's impact on food.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Derek. The canal changed food through a series of interconnected threads that were both direct and indirect. And fundamentally, the canal allowed for ease of transport of both raw product and finished goods throughout the canal corridor and beyond to the west and the north. And this cut transportation of goods by 95%, which is an extraordinary amount to think about today, allowing the transport of larger amounts of product by any one supplier, but also enabling economic transport of goods that were inherently more expensive, either in their production or in their acquisition. And as a result, numerous areas along the canal grew to foster production of various food products on grand scale, at times supplying the entire nation with the lion's share of specific products, from cheese to salt to flour. And we're going to discuss all of those in this presentation. At its peak in 1855, over 33,000 commercial transactions took place. And the canal enabled the cost-effective transport of commercial equipment required for large-scale food production, both agricultural and factory-based. And it transformed the life of the everyday kitchen, as Amanda has pointed out, as stoves and other related products were shipped outward from manufacturing towns. But there were also indirect influences on food culture, and the canal transformed businesses while also transforming towns along its route. And cities sprang up where there were once towns, and even small villages expanded, not only to meet the demands of expanding population and related industry, but also tourism, which is an integral part of traffic on the canal, as many of you know. Grocers, hotels, and taverns all along the corridor were needed to provide foodways infrastructure and support economies for local townsfolk, business interests, and visitors. And in many ways, it altered completely the way people even looked at cities as achievements of the nation, but also places where you travel to enjoy sights and activities, but also food. Because of course, throughout any journey, you need to be fed. If you could change to the next slide, Amanda. So the comparison of canal and rail transport is a wonderful illustration of how history is really never linear. The transformation of the rail system happens alongside the canal and begins very shortly after the canal first opens. In Syracuse, this happens in 1839 with the opening of the Utica and Syracuse Railroad line, leading to competition after almost a decade-long monopoly enjoyed by the canal route. The first transcontinental railroad, with over 1,900 miles of track, connected the existing Eastern Rail with the Pacific Coast shortly after the Civil War. And in general, rail further impacted relative costs and transport speeds as compared to the Erie Canal. But one critical rail invention transforms the food industry forever, and that is the introduction of the refrigerated boxcar. This ushers in a shift from transporting live animals to slaughter, and creating the transfer of the already slaughtered animals in transport. And you can just imagine what that small shift did to the entire cost of the meat sector. Yet despite these increased advantages of the railroad, the realities are that the Erie Canal was really not eclipsed until the 20th century. And can you go to the next slide, please, Amanda? The result of this increased mobility of food goods at such deeply reduced cost, still guaranteeing freshness, is reflected in the 1870 painting of a market in New York City. You can take the girl out of the curator, but you can't take the curator out of the girl. I'm going to have a bunch of images, arts images in my presentation. I want you to look closely at what you see here. Amid the more commonplace watermelon and cantaloupes, you see more exotic pineapples and bananas. And canal routes and rail provided the access by which Western cities in New York and beyond could procure these items. And they begin to show up in cookbooks and receipts. Exotic foods are now within economic reach at various times of the year. And it's why a woman in Rochester could serve oysters, figs, and oranges to guests in a March luncheon in 1884. And none of that product was, of course, local. The objects used to display and serve food were also impacted by the canal. Glassware, china, and other tableware were cheaper to purchase, both because of industrialization and because of transport. And imported wares from as far away as China and later Japan find their way in even the smallest town purveyors. Next slide, Amanda. And along with transport advances, there were major breakthroughs in food preservation. These innovations were employed by families, but also in large-scale manufacturing, providing both easier packing and longer shelf life for perishable products. It allows for mass production of any given product with consistency, which is what you need to apply to a mass market, is consistency of deliverable product. Some notable advances include the isolation of pectin, allowing for preservation of fruit through jams and jellies, the introduction of the world's first granulated gelatin, the mason jar, which many of us still use today, although commercially this was gradually replaced by new products and methods for commercial canning. And other innovations were the creation of baking powder, baking soda, and vacuum sealed jars. Entrepreneurs in Syracuse contributed to these efforts as well. The Merrill Sewell Company served as a major canning company, but also developed methods to package and transport mincemeat made from dry ingredients. And you see an ad for that at the bottom. Later still, they produced powdered milk and a form of powdered lemon extract. The company also showed innovation in other food-related ways, opening in-company dining facilities in their factory, an earlier adapter of this practice. These innovations and others led to new advances in scaling production, but also in increasing the sheer variety of products sought out by individual households, either already preserved or fresh product purchased with knowledge that shelf life could be extended through home preservation. Can you go to the next slide? Connectivity between print media, travel, and consumerism during this period is critical relative to foodways. Print media would both influence taste and reflect evolving realities throughout the 19th century. The previous slide showed examples of increasing widespread advertising targeted at the middle class for products related to food production and consumption. And the growing industry of print household manuals and cookbooks recommended how you should keep a household, what to acquire, what food to prepare and serve, and how to present all of this in your home. Your table and the goods on it became an expression of your class, your sophistication, and your modernity. And these filtered down to everyday life at respective income levels. Printed media, though, also reflected and inspired the growing interest of an increasing middle class who had extra income and time to spend for travel. Illustrated and richly narrated guidebooks informed the potential traveler about all the highlights an excursion had to offer, but it also provided vital suggestions about where to stay, and perhaps, and more importantly for this talk, where to eat. For example, in 1873, the well-known Appleton's Journal featured hotels that welcomed female diners, critical information for the increasing number of women who were traveling alone. The next slide, Amanda. Both professional and amateur artists, travelers were also key in providing fine and popular art printed images to advance the lure of canal travel and American tourism more generally. And of course, frankly, for the graphic design of all these adverts we're seeing. At left is one in a fall 1825 portfolio of drawings discovered in 2015 in the collection of the library at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. 37 watercolors depicting the canal created by newly ordained 32-year-old clergyman John Henry Hopkins from Pittsburgh, also a talented artist and architectural illustrator. He was on the canal only days after it opened, and his drawings represent rare images from this early period. As the decades wore on, large-scale commissioned work of canal scenes became more popular, like the circa 1871 work by Johann Mengel's Culverhouse, depicting Clinton Square by moonlight, owned by the Onondaga Historical Association. A diary entry by Caroline Hall of Vermont describing her June 1834 Tuesday evening arrival in Syracuse via the canal captures the spirit of this painting. But it also reminds us that women were traveling as tourists on the canal, as well as men. And the next large town we encountered was Syracuse, she writes. Here was grandeur itself. It was just at sunset when we entered the place. The scenery was beautiful beyond description. Each side of the canal is lined with lofty buildings from 3 to 4 stories high. And as cities and towns began to thrive on the canal, they can support these local artists who can serve the demands of residents and visiting tourists alike. Amanda's search of the census records found artist Byron Miner listed in 1875 in Rochester, and a woman artist, Garusha McClellan, listened in Syracuse alongside her husband, daughter, sister, and several servants in 1875. And art has to do with food in that we're moving away from a sustenance culture to both art and food as products of leisure and enjoyment. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda.
Thank you. All right, so we are going to shift a little, and Valerie touched on it some, to talk about from the technology, all those major changes, and we want to focus on who these people are. And there's a lot of stereotyping that happens along with the canal that you hear at least in history. And so we wanted to, that's kind of where our starting point was. Who was really working there? Are the stereotypes at least even partly true? And and see the role these people played in getting food to the American table. So we're going to start with farming, and we want to talk about the enslaved workers that could have been part of that. I think I double slide. No, I didn't. Okay, sorry. The enslaved workers were, my notes are messed up. Sorry. Fine. Oh, here we are. Give me 1 minute. No, I'm missing a page. That's okay. So what we have here is a picture of an enslaved worker, and I believe this might be Fort Clock. And what one of my colleagues has been working on what slavery was looking like in New York, and this is a slide he let me use, and it gives you a good example of how many households had enslaved people in 1790. So to jog your memory, manumission was completed in 1827. But so it's 1790, there's definitely still enslaved people in New York. And we're seeing that the shift that Travis, who created this, is making is that he wanted to look at households with enslaved instead of just, in the past, a lot of people were kind of downplaying that there was slavery in New York by saying, oh, it was only 10% of the population, which of course is not okay anyway. But when you look at the households with an enslaved, it really ups the numbers. You see, in New Utrecht is, I believe, Brooklyn. They had 75% of the households had an enslaved person in them. In the Hudson Valley, you see Rhinebeck and Catskill had like 25 to 30%. And then in the Mohawk Valley, Schoharie had nearly 20% of the households. So if you think that 1 in 5 households had an enslaved worker in the home, in those areas, it's very likely they're farm workers, but they might have been someone working in the household creating food, and just gives you a better sense of who was working in these areas. Valerie?
I'm going to just talk a bit. I'm going to pivot from food for a moment. Who built the canal? Because when we talk about working, we need to think about who built this canal and the implications of that work on later food infrastructure. Many were Irish and German immigrants, as well as local farmers and populations of newly freed African Americans. This shouldn't be surprising, since Irish immigrants in the United States were dominant into the early 1840s, and then overtaken by Germans through the 1890s. And there were cries for native-born Americans, to do this work, but the vast majority was done by immigrant labor. And some of the Irish labor force was in fact recruited while still in their native land, and ads were placed in Catholic and local newspapers throughout Ireland. And often those who took up the call signed their contracts before passage. And that meant their employment and travel therefore constituted a cost to their employer, and workers needed to clear their debt. Others were actually solicited by American published Irish newspapers like the Weekly Shamrock in New York City. And here the opportunities for jobs were directly linked to possibilities for future land ownership, which was a lure for many immigrants. But I find it interesting that they were also lured by the promise of food. Meat 3 times a day, plenty of bread and vegetables with a reasonable amount of liquor. And then it states later, $8 to $10 or $12 a month for wages. And there was also a whiskey ration. Workers often, though, went on to establish roots in nearby towns and would in many instances grow even larger after the canal opened. This directly impacted the need for food-related infrastructure, both during and after the build: grocers, taverns, and other foodstuffs purveyors. And one other population was considered for work on the canal, which I think is really interesting. In 1817, legislation was passed to use prison labor if necessary. And I did find one account of 30 convicts from Auburn Prison working 16 months to build the aqueduct in Rochester. One unexpected reference struck me, though, relative to African American contributions to canal. Here is DeWitt Clinton's burial monument in Brooklyn Cemetery, and I'm an art historian at core, so I look at these types of objects for clues. This is a work by Henry Kirk Brown, and it's one of the first major bronzes actually erected into this country. On the central panel are a series of figures related to the canal. And one of them is an African-American man. And I wish I had a better image of that bas relief, but I just can't find one. As opposed to much African-American imagery, the man depicted on this bas-relief is not bent or in chains, and he's standing on par with other figures, and he's both the same size and in scale and prominence. And art historian Karen Lemmy comments, he's not sleeping, he's not depicted in the vein of minstrels, and he's not in the position of supplication. He's an active person, an active part of the commerce and wealth created by the Erie Canal. And it just shows that historical sort of clues can come from unexpected places, which is some of what we're going to be talking about, all the sort of places that we need to check out when we're trying to piece together this new type of research. Thanks, and I will turn it over to you, Amanda. And I will speak a little more slowly. Thank you for calling me out on that.
Yeah, sorry, we have a lot that we want to do here and we're trying to cut it down. One of the points I missed on my last slide also is that the Erie Canal was really an important part of the Underground Railroad, and folks that were freedom seekers that were able to escape via the Underground Railroad on the Erie Canal also often ended up working along the Erie Canal with, they became stewards, cooks, waiters, and even firemen. And former enslaved workers were used to help build the locks and Lockport. And so I think we also see, an absence of African Americans working in factories. And when talking with our interpreter of African American history, she really just, we're seeing that we believe factory owners preferred to white labor, and especially even if they had to import it from Europe, they preferred white labor. But there is a presence all along the canal anyway. And there's also a presence, if we think about this former enslaved population in New York and freedom seekers coming to places in the North, there was definitely a population of people in the Mohawk Valley who were former enslaved workers as well. But so what we did is with this talk is we kind of take a few cities and use them as examples of larger population trends. And the first city we're going to do is Little Falls. So I want to talk a little bit of farming in the Mohawk Valley. This is Herkimer Homestead Historic Site, which is near Little Falls. And what we find is that most of the people farming were native born, but there definitely were immigrants. There were definitely some variety, but I think part of the fact that it's mostly native born is there were some laws restricting when you could own land. You had to be in the country for a few years, at least in part of the 19th century. And so Little Falls is just this great example of how a city grew around the canal. In the 18th century, this area was considered the breadbasket of really the country. But with the opening of the Erie Canal, wheat in the western part of the nation could be harvested earlier than New York wheat. And so it glutted the markets before New York wheat could be harvested. So a lot of the farmers in the Mohawk Valley switched to become dairy farmers. And Little Falls is this really interesting culmination of innovation and that farming shift. So in Little Falls, they started to apply the ideas of the Industrial Revolution to cheese making. And what they, like Valerie mentioned, they really wanted consistency of product. So the first cheese factories were started in Little Falls, where they created co-ops. Local farmers would bring their milk to one place, and the best cheesemakers would make the cheese. And the success of these places led to an open air market starting in 1861, which at this open air market, they started to set the prices for the nation in cheese. They installed telegraphs so they could send the prices to New York City, and it set it for the nation. So just for example, there's a couple different people who started cheese factories, and Harry Burrell was one of them. And he started exporting cheese even as early as the 1820s to places like England, which had their own dairy industry. So this is the quality of product that was coming out of this. In the 1890s, Little Falls was surpassed by Wisconsin for cheese making. And I think that refrigerated boxcar had a lot to do with it, that you could ship the dairy product further. And it weakened the dairy industry, but I'm sure, well, I suspect you're aware that there's still quite a big dairy industry in New York. And they were mainly really survived because of all the tourist areas in New York, both in the Adirondacks and the St. Lawrence. They were able to ship a lot of their product there. So I think they shifted from making cheese to sending milk and cream to those places. And just looking through the census records in Little Falls, I wanted to point out a couple families to you that maybe had been overlooked in the past. One of these families is Anne and Charles Carpenter. They're an African-American mother and son living in Little Falls. And Charles is a saloon waiter at the age of 15. So that just gives it, and Anne doesn't seem to have a vocation, which is common for a woman in the household. And her birthplace is Montgomery County and his is Herkimer County. So they are local to this area. I believe Anne is listed as widowed. Another family in the vicinity, they're in Montgomery County, is the Bakeman family. And Henry Bakeman gained his freedom from slavery during the Revolutionary War by serving in the army. And once freed, he ran a cooper shop, a ferry, and he then purchased a large farm, which his descendants can be found in the area throughout the 19th century, including one of his grandchildren who served in the Union Army. And the last person I want to point out, so is Tyrone Jackson. He's also a person of color living in Little Falls. And in 1875, he's listed as having his own household. It's next to another farm. So it could be that his dwelling is on the farm, and he's 70 years old, but still listed as a laborer. The next city we chose was the Syracuse, the Salt City. And we did this even before we were talking at this museum. And so in Syracuse and the surrounding areas, there were salt deposits, as I'm sure many people know. And the Onondaga Nation was boiling salt from these deposits even in the mid-18th century. And the United States gained this area in 1788 with the understanding that others should have access to it. That's part of the treaty. And it just really helped this area grow. And this is another view. Syracuse's location along the canal was convenient for lots of industries. Syracuse, even after the salt deposits were depleted, was able to be an industrial hub, shipping soda ash, traffic lights, typewriters, and many other things, which I think Valerie will talk about a few of them later. So what I did in this area is I looked at 2 different wards in Syracuse in the census records, and then I've also looked at Salina, the nearby area. So my information on the census records is coming from that. And I pulled from there any people that had work related to food industries. So including many women working primarily as cooks in households. That's where we see most of the women. Of those people that I pulled from that, the largest percentage of them are native born, but in Syracuse, the next largest group are Irish. And in Salina, the next largest group are Germans. And those groups are represented in both cities and really in all of these cities that we're going to talk about. I didn't find any women working in the salt industry. Now, there could have been, but of the records I looked at, I didn't see any of them. So this is, I'm just trying to talk a little bit more about the salt industry since it was so important to this area. Travel journals mentioned it. It became a tourist attraction. And one travel journal mentioned that 15 to 20,000 gallons of water were passing through these every day to the solar evaporation. And another travel journal talks about acres and acres of field covered with vats for solar evaporation. One of those travel journals is William Stone, and he writes about the village of Salina. So it says, the village of Salina has grown prodigiously since my last visit in 1820. It now contains many large and well-built stores, warehouses, and handsome street dwellings, and 3 or 4 beautiful churches, including a neat edifice belonging to the Roman Catholics, which if there were that many Irish, I think they would probably need a Catholic church. So who was in this industry? We see from the census records that about 30% of the people in food-related industries, the ones I looked at in Syracuse, were in a salt-related industry. And in Salina, it was closer to 50% of the population. Just for comparison, only about 12% of the people I polled were in the canal industry. Now, it could be the wards I was looking at. I'm sure in a different ward, you'll get slightly different numbers. But it's as big as the canal was, it seems like salt was bigger. And so that was, transportation was both canal and railroad that I looked. I did mark those people as related to food. And in Salina, as I mentioned earlier, there was a greater number of German immigrants, but you're also seeing Swiss, English, Irish, Canadian, Danish, and French. And in Syracuse, I just wanted to note that though I didn't see as many female workers in Salina, 20% of the workers I looked at were women, including 5 of them were saloon keepers, which it looked from the records as if they were they ran the saloon and then had other people working for them. And just to give you an idea of the kind of tourist activity on the canal, there were 6 hotel keepers in Salina and 7 in Syracuse, just in those 2 wards. They were, so that gives you an idea of how much the canal impacted these places.
And thanks, Amanda. And I just want to remind people that salt is also and has long been a preserving agent for food. So I think we often think of salt in ways of contemporary flavoring agent, but it's a key preserver. And I want to now talk about the experience of one specific family, Ellen and Charles Wheaton, and how they provide an intersection for many aspects of the canal we've been talking about already. And this is a family whose increasing business success was indirectly tied to, but directly located on the banks of the canal. In the early days in Syracuse, most shipping focused on produce or animal-based product. But Wheaton, by contrast, went into the hardware business soon after he, Ellen, and their first child moved to Syracuse in 1835. And when his original hardware store burned in 1851, he built C.A. Wheaton and Company, housed in the city's grandest mercantile block, a 4-story building overlooking the Erie Canal and Clinton Square. Wheaton later unsuccessfully sought political office, including as canal commissioner. And so there's always these sort of intersections of there's always 2 degrees of separation from the canal. They, as well as other in Syracuse, were ardent abolitionists. And on October 1st, 1851, Wheaton was one of those involved in the rescue of William Jerry Henry, an escaped slave apprehended and jailed in Syracuse. And you see a contemporary monument commemorating that event at the upper right of your screen. Purportedly, axes and iron bars from Wheaton's hardware store were among those items employed in the rescue. But I actually really want to focus on the diary of his wife, Ellen, recounting aspects of her daily life and that of her family. Its presence in and of itself elevates a woman's voice, albeit I am the first to admit one of privilege. But the diary also gives us information about those who were working in this house, such as identifying the many seamstresses she needed to help her sewing the clothing of what were a dozen children in that household. And many of these seamstresses could have been women of color. There were 2 live-in staff, a kitchen maid, and an African-American servant named George Johnson. And they both lived with the family on the house on East Genesee Street. I love that in the diary, we get a name and we can center that sort of agency and story around Mr. Johnson. Certainly further digging will be required here, but these also reinforce facts that we've already covered about prevailing jobs of both working class women and people of color along canal towns. This is just one example of the diverse industry that would rise out of Syracuse throughout the century. But I want to note that food production remains strong, including confectioners and brewers. And as late as 1910, food production factories remained in the top 10 industries of the city, with 26 factories. Only iron and steel related products and textiles had more factories, with an additional 10 factories dedicated to liquor and beverage production. So links to Syracuse and the canal in terms of food extended well beyond salt. And can you go to the next slide, Amanda? First known as the Young Lion of the West and then as the Flower City, Rochester became the largest flower producing city in the nation, and the canal made the transport of the product in high volume possible. The mills grew to manufacturing 5,000 barrels of flour a day and almost 2 million a year. Over time, the center of that wheat processing industry moved west with population and agriculture. But like Syracuse, the city needed to rely on other types of industry as well. And the city also became known for its extensive nursery business, giving rise to the city's second name, again, the Flower City, but this time with an OW. And large and small nurseries ringed this city. The most famous was started by immigrants, George Ellwanger from Germany and Patrick Barry from Ireland. But later still, the city became a confectionery hub. And for example, James Demarath was the first confectioner in America to commercially distribute marshmallows beginning in 1895. Can you go to the next slide? And as you can surmise in a booming city, there were just a lot of different types of occupations, just like in Syracuse. And yes, you had people supporting the manufacturing sectors I just referenced, but you also had other strong industries, such as the tailoring industry represented at the top. On the bottom is May Bragdon, who settled in Rochester with her family at the age of 24, and she represents sort of a shift that happens. She had a series of office-related jobs, including positions at a safe company and a cutler manufacturing company. Ultimately, she became an executive secretary, and her preserved diary and photographs beginning in the 1880s offer a glimpse into the professional opportunities for women that began emerging in cities made prosperous by the canal. Earlier 1875 census records indicate many women employed, like Amanda has already mentioned, as housekeepers, domestics, and cooks. And it's hard to know if these were in private homes or in the growing hospitality industry. Other census snapshots record things like male laborers, lawyers, and clerks. References to professions Amanda has already, I think, mentioned, which are African-American barbers. This was a profession often undertaken by freed African-American men. And barber George Hamilton lived with Mary, his mother, a housekeeper, and a boarder Sarah, who was listed as a cook. And it just again shows the consistency of women as domestic help in this period. Downtown in the same ward, Charles Lauder, an African-American baker, also resided. And these individuals represent just a wide range of employment to keep a complex canal city like Rochester moving along in the third quarter of the century. Finally, Rochester, like Little Falls, had listings for hotel keepers and hotel clerks, such as Wesley Crouch at Whitcomb House. And these hotels, increasingly known as palaces of the people, served traveling businessmen, but also tourists traveling along the canal as part of the Grand American Tour, which of course, I think many of us know culminated at Niagara Falls. Can you go to the next slide, Amanda? Of course, the canal had made leisure travel become easier, and to meet the growing demand of the increasing middle class who had both leisure time and dispensable income. And packet boats like the one you see here provided opportunities to travel overnight on board or to disembark at various locales to visit, dine, and stay. And you could reboard the same boat or another boat to continue the journey depending on, of course, the timetable. Many famous people would write about this experience, including Mark Twain and Herman Melville, and even foreign visitors like Charles Dickens. But increasingly, news sources like the 1826 travel diary of Alexander Stewart Scott, published by SUNY Press in 2019, give us accounts of more typical travelers. Boats were often 70 feet long with a kitchen and bar in the back, and there was a woman's cabin in front, but the curtain separating that was removed at mealtime to accommodate one long communal dining table. Many accounts of eating on board were typically positive, and in 1836, Thomas Woodcock made the trip from Schenectady to Buffalo, commenting, "The table is supplied with everything that is necessary and of the best quality, with many of the luxuries of life." What I think is interesting and indicative of this kind of reportage is Alas, we often don't know exactly what they mean by great food and the luxuries of life. We only know that it was a positive experience. So who was running these boats? This employed thousands of people, actually tens of thousands of people along the canal. And some contemporary accounts refer to captains of these boats as gentilmen, setting them apart from the other crew, although other accounts assert a relatively rough bunch all around. The Syracuse Standard reported in 1903 that the cooks on the boats were primarily African American men. An excerpt from an 1832 letter by a young Ethan Salter, whose family lived on and operated a canal boat, illuminate the experience of those employed on the canal versus those traveling. And it says, Pa says, I'm too small to drive the mules. Mostly I take care of the mules and help Mom with the cooking. But many of my friends on other canal boats start at about age 12, driving and caring for the mules. And indeed, young boys made up a large percentage of the driving force. Salter goes on that the local lock keepers and shops along the canal often stay open 24 hours. And there is also a bum boat that has fresh vegetables and meats. And Ma prepares meals all along, all for the passengers who want full board, because you could buy passage with full board or without. And this last reference is a reminder that there were many necessary industries that needed to come up that supported the canal boats directly, including those providing perishable supplies for those cooking on board. Can you go to the next slide, Amanda? As I've already mentioned, private journals were really important in illuminating what it felt like to travel, but also to help us piece together how operations functioned and who was working on the canal and in what capacity. And more of these journals are coming online all the time. I've mentioned the 1820s Journal of Alexander Scott already, but we can compare his writings to the 1845 Journal of Deacon M. Eaton, who spent 5 years on the canal as a missionary, going from boat to boat. And on the screen are images from a diary of 1895, recounting the journey of 4 women who traveled together up the Hudson River and then up the Northern Canal on a series of boats, including those carrying freight like coal and timber, reminding us that the canal at its core was about the goods transport. Here you see how tugboats pulled canal boats up the Hudson River Valley from New York City, and also a depiction of their own captain of their canal boat. 70 years collectively separate the journals of Scott, Eaton, and the women travelers, but we can trace consistencies in their accounts. Can you go to the next slide, Amanda? These first-hand observations, both written and the visual is often just as important as the written, capture small details that affirm general truths. In the case of the pages of the women's diary, we get snippets about what they ate, an evening dinner of Boston baked beans, ketchup, mince pie, and cocoa, and a midday dinner of whitefish, potatoes, and bread. What kind of products they saw loaded, like ice, which I want you to remember is a key product in food preservation and was a huge commercial crop throughout the 19th century, and also who worked on the canal. This illustration shows a young widow and her children whose son took over running the boat after her husband died. Her other teenage son is working on another boat. She and her daughters cook and clean, and the younger boys work also on the boat. Her youngest 3 children are all under 10. Here they are resting under makeshift tents, often set up on the decks of these boats. Deacon Eaton's journal also mentions the many young boys working on the canal, often orphans traveling from far away, seeking to scratch out a living. Eaton doesn't glamorize the hardship of this life and how many are claimed every year by swamp fever and how many more are cheated out of their wages by those in higher positions. But Eaton also affirms the presence of African-American males, often serving as cooks on these boats. Each diary represents the subjective experiences and observations of the writer, for certain. But when examined collectively, they begin to coalesce around some clear pictures of what it meant to work on the canal boats versus have the pleasure of traveling on them. Can you go to the next slide, Amanda? Part of the benefit of this travel was that you could get off and see the sights in an individual town, and many offered taverns and inns for visitors, and larger cities built hotels with rooms to accommodate many, many guests. These hotels also soon began to include formal dining rooms. And even as early as Scott's diary in 1826, he recounts visiting or staying in hotels where he could have a meal, take a bath, or overnight with over 200 other boarders. In larger towns and cities, these hotels needed to accommodate traveling businessmen as well. And eateries, both humble and fancy, served an increasing working population who no longer went home for the midday meal. And that's a really important, also a shift in foodways and dining practice. At lower right is an example of an informal establishment, which offers simple fare a la carte. And you can see that it is managed by a woman, Mrs. Jackson, to whom you must inquire for employment. But at the same time, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women still had difficulty being served at fine restaurants if they arrived unaccompanied by men. Yet other establishments began to cater to female shoppers who wanted lunch, opening near dry goods emporia and department stores. And as women in cities began to work outside of the home, inexpensive restaurants and confectionery shops in what were known as respectable settings grew as well. But by the end of the 19th century, we see the culmination of this industrial growth and its resulting wealth. And the hotels become larger and ornate, overtly mimicking the trappings, decor, and indulgences of European aristocracy. And many of these hotels start to employ French chefs, the latest fashion for Americans' wealthy families, and these chefs were all male, of course. Middle-class visitors, though, to these hotels were then exposed to this elevated cuisine, and through these myriad cookbooks and other media, they were offered instruction how to emulate this food. Can you go to the next slide, Amanda? Syracuse is a wonderful example of the plethora of hotels, over 50, which some that began as more modest enterprises in early years of canal growth, but often were then augmented or rebuilt as the century wore on and ownership changed. And here is just a small selection. The Yates, which opened in 1892 to a reception of 4,000 locals, and later the site of many banquets and conventions. And to me, this is a really important individual aspect of Syracuse foodways. Syracuse as a convention city and the implication of that on food and dining and staffing warrants an entire other lecture. At the center is the Empire House, and at the bottom is Manhattan House. All of these went under through several iterations and many different owners. But I want to go back to Congress Hall, originally built in 1876, and an advert for which you saw in the previous slide. Note that other hotels, as you see here, are advertised through postcards. Now, at left, you see the increasing complexity of food offerings at these hotels as the century wears on. This is a breakfast menu from 1890 from Congress Hall, but I've also seen a supper menu from that hotel in the same year. And supper was meant to be the lightest meal of the day, served from 6 to 8:30. And that menu shows diverse offerings combining traditional breakfast and dinner fare, from mush and milk to omelets to griddle cakes to 5 different types of potatoes to cold meats to hot dishes like hamburger steak and lake trout. And it's only later in the century that you're finding things referred to like hamburger steak. There are no desserts on a supper menu, and beverages were restricted to coffee, tea, chocolate, or milk. Next slide, Amanda. So who's working to supply all of these people with food outside of their home? And throughout the century, women of all races and ethnicity were employed out of sight, primarily in commercial kitchens as cooks, kitchen helpers, and dishwashers, while men dominated management at the front of the house. Hotel dining rooms were typically staffed by African-American men as waiters, but progressively white immigrant males took over the service presence in restaurant dining rooms, and male chefs took over in the upscale kitchens. But the number of women running restaurants of their own increased in the latter 19th century, although more opportunities admittedly were offered further west. Women also ran food services in major department stores, including bakeries, candy kitchens, and restaurants, and the middle-class tea rooms that would emerge in the early 20th century. The Downing family were one of many African American families that took up catering trade in free cities. Like undertaking and barbering, catering was a service occupation which offered opportunity and more autonomy. Thomas Downing opened a successful oyster bar in Broad Street in New York City in the 1820s, and that's quite early. More research is something we must do to see if there are similar stories along the canal, which I suspect there are. One local story I did find was Jane and Thomas Leonard, who were part of a small African-American community in Syracuse. And after migrating from Virginia, they worked and lived in Syracuse until they died. And Thomas worked as a waiter, a cartman, boatman, and laborer, and Jane worked as a cook at the Exchange Hotel. So all tied completely back to sort of food related and food infrastructure relative to the Erie Canal. So next is, I want to just conclude by giving some examples that are going to force you to think more broadly about food industry. And I want to use examples where women had large influence, indirectly or directly. On the left is a woman applying painted decoration on a china plate at the Syracuse China Company, originally opened as the Onondaga Pottery Company in the 1870s. This Syracuse-based company developed a method for making durable but high-quality translucent tableware that supplied hotels, restaurants, and later cruise boats throughout the country. And that was a need that was first fostered by travel and subsequent hotel growth that we can trace directly back to the canal. At right is Mary Elizabeth Steezens, who began in Syracuse at a very young age to develop a candy making business at the turn of the century. And you see her here with her sisters at right pouring heated molasses. And the company employed other women as well. She supported her family, and the business became incredibly successful. By 1904, her candy was being sold in elite New York City clubs and hotels, and later to summer resorts in Newport and in stores as far away as Chicago. And you see an advertisement here, and I just want to reinforce again that food and the media are inextricably linked during this period. Lastly, I want to mention another enterprising woman who would envision how the Schrafft's Candy Company would evolve into a national restaurant chain. Jane Shattuck, sister of a Schrafft salesman, was largely responsible for the introduction of light lunches into all company stores throughout the country. It's perhaps not surprising that the very first to serve food was the Syracuse store in 1906, where a Japanese tea room was boldly advertised as the daintiest luncheon spot in all the state. High praise indeed. And I hope that both Amanda and I are going to be able to find more stories like these of enterprising women and people of color who impacted foodways along the entire canal route.
All right. Well, thank you very
Hold
much.
on, I have one more. Let me finish. Sorry, I was having trouble getting it to unmute. I just want to say a real quick closing. I know we're running a little bit behind, but as Valerie said, we're reading this, and we have a lot of people we want to follow and get more information on. And we just hope that you guys are eyes are open to all the different kinds of people that are working all along the canal. And I just leave you with these tourists. These are from the Thousand Islands area, and we have kind of different scales of tourism. And we're not sure whether these people are working as in a service industry, or maybe they're there for a school. They weren't identified. And I think the picture on the left, the people were, it's the same photo in two different places. I found it. One place said they were servants and another place said they were free. So I think there's just so much left to find. And we're going to look in all these different journals and other places that we're going to unlock the answers to this. So thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt, Eric, and we'd love to answer questions if there are any.
Yeah, sorry about that. I hope everyone didn't leave when I prematurely said goodbye. So there have been some questions, I know, both here on Zoom, and we've had really active participation here on Facebook. So one of the earliest ones, a guy said, Scott on Facebook said, my ancestors shipped beets on the canal from their farm in Macedon, New York. I'm guessing these may have been for processing into sugar and not for direct consumption. Have anything to say about that? Curious.
I have not researched beets at all, though I'd love to.
I suspect you are correct. There was and continues to be in other parts of the country even today large scale sugar from beet production, but I don't want to double down on that until both Amanda and I do a little research. And I myself saw in the chat, as I was referencing the refrigerator boxcar, about sort of the date that happens a little before mid-century, but the person who asked me the question about the refrigerated boxcar asked about the 1880s. And the reason that date probably sticks out in the mind of whoever's asking that question is by the 1880s, real high volume and far-reaching distribution of these refrigerated boxcars really gets going full steam in the 1880s, where you are just shipping massive amounts of sides of beef, in particular from the Chicago slaughterhouses, over the course of one weekend. And just as an aside, very early on when Amanda and I started doing this research and we were doing a lot of cooking, we were finding all these beef in recipes from certain periods. And when you find it in middle-class cookery, you just know that it means it's not that expensive. And of course, you come to understand that it was something like the refrigerated boxcar, which completely transformed the availability and use and cost of this type of product. And when looking at old cookbooks, you always have to sort of inform what you're looking at in terms of the product you're seeing around some of the things that we've been framing for you this afternoon, and why you sort of see what appear to be sometimes weird things showing up at weird times in 19th century cookbooks. So I had taken out the exact date of the refrigerated boxcar, but I wanted to make sure I addressed that.
Right, thank you. Just real quick, since I've been researching this exhibit we're putting up, I've run into sugar beets. Just to kind of help answer the question, there was in Lyons, New York, right near Macedon, there was the Empire State Sugar Company, which processed sugar beets. It's another factory in Rome. So Scott, if you're still with us, that might have been who your grandfather was making stuff for. But anyway, we've got some other ones. Ooh, Dave asked the question. He has a couple of questions. One is, were there any regulations on food at the time? And unrelated, are there any tales of boat fires due to cooking stoves?
I did not come across any tales of boat fires, though everyone feared fire and still does. I think but I think, I think in Deacon Eaton's book, there were incidents of people being burned on boats, but I don't know that the whole boat burned. And I don't know. I mean, I think I doubt there were a lot of regulations on food, because I think that really is happening in the early 20th century a lot more. I don't know, Valerie, do you want to?
It's funny, I'm trying to channel a talk we gave a couple years ago at Olana about when these regulations come into effect. And it's one of those things where it's buried in a file in the back of my brain and I just cannot access it at the moment. But you're going to start to see it. I think at this point, no, people are really concerned, though. In some ways, the marketplace is driving things. People are expecting consistency of product, freshness of product. And we're at a point of incredible capitalism at this moment, where someone else asked, are receipts being dictated both up and down the social strata? Yes, they are. And so, but increasingly, kind of like the equivalent of, let's say, a 21st and 20th century Martha Stewart living, you're trying to, so much instruction is happening to sort of try to indoctrinate this new middle class and then sort of elevate them in a sort of mimicking of the upper class. And so kind of like Martha Stewart in some way, when you go and you look at all these guidebooks, it's impossible to really discern always what people are reading and digesting and what then they are actually putting into practice on the table. So you see all kinds of suggestions, and there's suggestion that some of those things are actually employed relative to financial viability. But I am certain that in other instances, it was just fun to read, and it didn't necessarily mean that that's what you were going to do. And similarly, you start to see in receipt books, in particular, as we approach the centennial, that you start to see these sort of throwback recipes, these sort of old-timey, colonial, simplified recipes that find their way then to sort of elegant dining tables. So the answer to that question is yes, it does move up and down the scale.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting, and I think it relates to another question sort of that we had. I think similarly related to these kind of narratives built by the upper classes at points, which it was when you were talking about building the canal and the immigrant labor that was often involved. Dave said local signage says that the first canal, so the original one, was built by, quote, native workers, and the expansion was by the Irish. What I love about this talk is how diverse you guys present the canal as being, which I think is much more accurate than this traditional tale we get told. Care to speak on that at all, about this idea that native-born Americans built the canal versus the Irish?
And when we mean native born, we're not talking about indigenous people. Yes. We're talking about native born in the 19th century usage of that word, which means you were born white in this country. And it is complicated. And I've looked at many different types of sources, including someone's dissertation on the Canal Commission, which was really interesting to me. Because what you see is, you see this call for native, there's a clear nativism element going on. And certainly native-born people enjoyed the engineer positions and other higher positions on the canal. And there's debate about how there are newspaper accounts that there are native people, native-born working the canal. But sort of the sources that I've read say that those were inflated. Those were inflated to basically appease a desire for native workers doing this incredible achievement. Unfortunately, Canal Commission reporting doesn't say where people are from until, it doesn't list where they're from. And so it makes tracking that really challenging. I think there's a lot more work to be done here, but I can cite in the 1850s, there is a legislation going into effect about, this was in our previous talk, about immigration and working in terms of the westward expansion. And one of the legislators who was also involved in the canal, in terms of in a political sphere, actually presented to Congress that without these populations, he actually cites the canal. It's like 3 decades later, and he's citing the canal as like, without this immigrant work, this wouldn't have happened. And so I think there's a lot more deep diving to do here. And I think my purpose was to show that, and I think when you look at newspaper accounts, newspaper accounts have a point of view, the way journals have a point of view. You have to sort of come to your best conclusion based on sort of the synthesizing of those various accounts. And so I definitely don't claim to be an expert on canal labor, but I wanted to contextualize it to make sure that these are also then the same people who begin to live and have other jobs in these areas, as Amanda was talking about. They have to, when the canal is done, many stay. And they have to figure out, what they're going to do next.
Well, and I just kind of to build on that, and I think it's an important message right now, is not every person that came to our country was an unskilled laborer. I think a lot of them brought their skills, probably in the salt industry, in the brewing industry. They brought skills that they already had in their home countries and brought them to our nation. So I think over and over, people are emphasizing that a lot of these industries, the cheese industry, someone came from Copenhagen to start a cheese factory in Little Falls and was there into the 20th century, them and their descendants. So bringing those skilled laborers into our nation and building and making it more successful because of immigrant labor.
And I think to sort of go down one step lower, like one level deeper in that, increasingly, when you're attending conferences around food production, especially in the relative to the 18th century, which is still involving in to large degree enslaved people in agricultural production, increasingly there is an understanding that those enslaved people were sought after and brought to this country because of knowledge of those crop production. Mm-hmm. And they themselves were skilled labor in the production of things like sugarcane. And so I think, we just have a lot more sort of widening of our understanding of how these things and these skills and these people are interconnected to what drives these economies, but then what also ultimately winds up on people's plates in this period.
Yeah, wonderful point there, I think. Yeah. All right. Let's see. It looks like we've only got one more question. If there are any more, please put them into the chat immediately. They wanted to know, Mary is wondering if there's any way she can kind of help out. Is there any crowdsourcing of transcribing historical documents or anything that might be of use to you guys?
That's a wonderful question.
The
journals, I would say the journals we're using are not in our collections, but we do have journals and collections at historic sites. Probably the best thing to do is to go wherever you're located. And I'm sure any historic site or museum would love to have you be transcribing. The problem with a lot of ours is some of them aren't digitized yet. I know there's one. So if you are, depending on where you are, Lorenzo State Historic Site, which isn't too far from Syracuse, definitely has a huge archive and wants to work on digitizing more and more. But at this point, we don't have the capacity for that, though I feel like there are some places doing that online.
I do too. I can't name who they are. I'm embarrassed to say. But I think it's a great, there are a lot of new projects coming online relative to the crowdsourcing of all kinds of documents. And Amanda and I just attended a virtual conference 2 weeks ago about textiles and textile workers in the United States. And they're beginning to do these big crowdsourcing sort of location finding of work people working in these trades, and sometimes it's only a name, sometimes it's a photograph. So there's certainly people doing that. I think in the food lane, there are many people working on these types of talks and projects, and we tend to sort of all be a little, I hate to say it, we stay kind of in our own lane. I don't know how to there are people who are really obsessed with like the replication of historic cooking methods of the 18th century. There are people really concentrated on replicating recipes. And then there are people, so we haven't been very good, not by design, but more, I think, just for lack of someone having asked someone that question very directly, of crowdsourcing that stuff. So there's still work to do. So the short answer is no, I don't know of anyone specifically, but it's a great idea.
All right. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, we're actually working on transcribing a collection from a farmer up in around Lake Champlain. So,
Oh, cool.
yeah, like a bunch of his letters. But I'm not seeing any other questions. I want to thank you both for this incredible talk. We haven't had any more questions in the comments, but a lot of thank yous, and they've really been enjoying the talk. I have as well. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone else who tuned in. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys.